The big idea I want to talk about today is the role of the state in money laundering. Most countries claim that they want to shut down money laundering, and that's what they say. But the evidence seems to show that the states are actually interested in encouraging and facilitating money laundering. Now, I'm going to walk you through some of this evidence, but before that, a quick question for all of you. If you were to imagine the amount of illicit financial flows across the world in a given year, if you were to imagine it as a giant pie, what proportion of it do you think comes from corruption? If we add the usual money laundering suspects, so organized crime, drugs trafficking, stuff like that, we'll still get to only 1/3 of the pie. And the rest of the 2/3, the bulk of money laundering, actually comes from something called cross-border tax-related transactions. So Amazon or Apple hiding their money in Ireland to get away from US tax authorities, or transfer pricing by large multinational corporations. Despite this, most people do think that corruption accounts for more money laundering than tax avoidance. And if you even think about the way that people talk about money laundering, so you'll hear phrases like ill-gotten gains, or you'll hear them say things like, criminals should not profit from their crime. Fair enough. But if our aim is to confiscate dirty money from bad actors, why are we only going after 1/3 of the pie? Why don't we want 2/3 of the pie? But perhaps the more fundamental question for us is, why does money laundering matter? It matters simply because when the rich underpay, the rest of us collectively pay more. So, for example, public healthcare is grossly underfunded. University education is very expensive. And don't even get me started on public transport. Let me be clear here. I'm not talking about not paying taxes. That's tax evasion. That's a crime. I am talking about those people and corporations who should pay more but don't because the law allows them to underpay. That's tax avoidance. It's ethically dodgy but perfectly legal, which is why so many people and corporations do it around the world. What am I calling dodgy behavior? That, to my mind, is someone like a small-time exporter of luxury vehicles in Halifax who hires a bunch of university students to drive brand new BMWs straight from the dealership onto shipping containers headed to China. Now, these cars are going to be exported as used cars, even though once they get to China, they're going to be sold for 5 times their value. That's called deliberate trade misinvoicing, and it exists so that people in China can get their money out of China. Is it illegal? That depends on who you talk to. Now, the Chinese authorities, they obviously have a problem with this capital flight from their shores. But in Canada, this practice is not even seen as money laundering. So what about dodgy behavior by rich people? Thanks to the Panama, the Pandora, and the Paradise Papers, almost everyone knows what us lawyers and finance people have known all along. 200 years of corporate law have gotten us to this moment where it's far easier than ever before to hide wealth. And again, using shell corporations, using trusts, using foundations to hide wealth is perfectly legal. But, of course, hidden wealth is difficult to tax. If one doesn't know who owns it, how is one to know who to tax? That is what is called the beneficial ownership problem. Now, if beneficial ownership and trade malpractices, if they are bigger contributors to money laundering than corruption and drugs, why are these practices allowed by the law? When our politicians, our law enforcement agencies, even our media, when they talk about money laundering, why are they so obsessed with crime? Now, both these questions are endlessly fascinating to me. First of all, I'm a lawyer. I am also a former financial journalist. But above all, I'm a student of power. And in order to answer this question of law, we need to understand how it intersects with power. And the simplest way I can put it is that generally the law codifies the interests of the powerful in society. It is designed to respond to their needs, not our needs. Let me illustrate this, showing you how anti-money laundering laws are constructed. The global regulator, that's the Financial Action Task Force on money laundering, they only crack down on the activities that you see to the left of the screen. That is the stuff that makes up 1/3 of the pie. On the right-hand side are the practices that FATF studiously ignores. Critically, the law almost everywhere in the world, it mirrors the FATF list, not the one on the right. But it would be a mistake to think of this focus on crime and corruption as either inadvertent or coincidental. It is neither. And we can see this when we look at what this law does. So first of all, when we zoom in on individual drugs traffickers or kleptocrats, we stop seeing tax-avoiding corporations or tax-avoiding individuals. The second point is that this crime story, this obsession with crime, it taps into our deepest social anxieties. We are told that if money laundering goes away, the opioids crisis is going to go away, or the housing affordability crisis is going to go away. That doesn't seem to ring true. Because just as long as people want drugs, or people want child pornography, or they want money laundering services, suppliers are going to come up. That's the way capitalism works. That's the way we've understood capitalism to work. Bankrupting drugs dealers isn't going to dry up the supply of drugs in our societies just as long as people do want drugs. Similarly, if we don't build new houses, there are going to be price wars over the existing stock of houses. That's basic demand and supply. Now, if this is so obvious to us, theoretically, it should be as obvious to our governments. Money laundering laws across the world should be reflecting these insights, and yet they don't. What we see instead are governments throwing wonky, flawed laws at the money laundering problem. And within even this space, we see that there is invasive financial sector surveillance, there's far more stricter law enforcement. Despite all of that, what we see is unabated laundering by repeat offenders. So the big global banks, think of Standard Chartered, HSBC, Bank of New York, Citibank, all those banks repeatedly getting charged for laundering. Then we also have football clubs in Europe, casinos in Canada, and charities in the UK. So clearly, the laws are not working. So then, why do our governments make these ineffectual laws? What do they gain from this entire exercise? In order to figure that out, we need to be able to separate the real from the unreal when it comes to the stories that we hear about money laundering. The first one I want to talk about is the Vancouver model. So in 2017, we all woke up to the fact that there were gamblers from mainland China who were coming into Vancouver with hockey bags full of cash. Most of us responded with shock and outrage. Except, as it turned out, gaming regulators in BC who had known about this particular mode of laundering for at least 7-8 years. I want to take a moment there because this is significant. The government officials who were tasked with protecting the system from money laundering, they knew it was happening, and they chose to remain silent simply because of how money laundering feeds into the political economy of the city, of the province, and even the country. Once we put our moral outrage and our self-righteousness about this aside, money is just money. So the gamblers were helping shore up the domestic economy, obviously the casinos, but also the hospitality sectors, the tourism sectors. Plus, the government was also making nice wads of tax revenues of the activities. And then, to top it all off, because casinos in Canada are part owned by crown corporations, the government also stood to take home a nice chunk of profits. All of this going to show that where a business is so hugely profitable and so beneficial for the broader political economy, even the state is not interested in whistleblowing. The other story I want to talk about is snow washing. Again, with the Panama Papers, we found out that shell companies could be used to hide wealth, and snow washing was the Canadian term given to this practice. Again, the significant piece here is the reaction of the state to this. The federal government claimed that it absolutely wanted to shut down snow washing. And their idea for doing so was coming up with public beneficial ownership registries. There, the point was that they were going to have these registries where people who owned more than 25% of a corporation, they would have to disclose their interest in the corporation. Great idea, except for the fact that 90% of corporations in Canada are registered provincially and not federally. So this federal law is only going to attack the 10% of corporations. And even there, the limit that the federal government came up with was 25%. Above 25%, and that's when you needed to disclose your interest. Now, even a second-year law student could tell you that's too high a limit to catch anything worthwhile. There are two lessons here. First, where a business provides value for the political economy, the state is always going to protect and facilitate it. No questions about it. The second point is that states act through their actions as well as their inactions. So if something didn't happen, like the crackdown on money laundering, it was probably not meant to happen. Think about anti-money laundering laws as a pair of distressed jeans. So far, we've been thinking that the holes are spontaneously occurring, or they are a manufacturing defect. They're not. They're a very carefully constructed design element. The holes are there because they were meant to be there. That's what we need to recognize. We can pretend that all governments were and remain serious about tackling money laundering, but they aren't, simply because of how embedded money laundering is in contemporary political economies of the world. And here I'm talking about countries such as the US, Canada, the UK, but Switzerland, Australia, a bunch of them. Let's talk about the US. Given that the state of Delaware makes 25% of its state budget by setting up shell corporations, and given that South Dakota is the trust's capital of the world, is it really such a surprise that the US does not have a zero-tolerance policy to money laundering? Is it really such a surprise? These industries, let's call them that, these industries, they provide employment for thousands of lawyers, tax consultants, accountants, bankers, a bunch of those people who plow their income and their taxes back into the real US economy. Then these guys also happen to be voters, which gives them political power over the state. Plus, their uber-wealthy clients happen to have a huge amount of political and economic power, which they exercise over the state and its policies. So yeah, the US does not have a zero-tolerance policy towards money laundering. Let's talk about Canada. if the domestic savings rate is approximately 6%, how is the Canadian economy to be financed? Yes, debt is an option, but Canada is not the US, and global trade is not denominated in Canadian dollars. So there is this reliance that Canada has on global capital. But what does Canada have to offer to the savvy global investor? Well, they've got decent rule of law, they've got a well-functioning justice system, and there is some measure of political stability. But these features, this financial environment, is hugely attractive to even kleptocrats and tax-avoiding corporations. And so, Canada has been open to several shades of illicit financial flows for a while. And we can see this when we track Canada's policies and laws over a period of time. And we see it reflected in Canada's business investment laws, its immigration laws, its corporate tax rates, even its disclosure rules. With all these policies, the state can be seen as materially encouraging and facilitating money laundering. And of course, with the help of literally armies of well-trained professionals, again, the lawyers, the accountants, those kind of folks, who help set up these legal arrangements. At the end of such talks, I'm usually pushed to offer solutions to the problem of money laundering. And my honest answer is that there aren't any. The state and its wealthy clients don't want solutions, and the law reflects their desires, not ours, and certainly not mine. So, is it useless to revolt? There, I'd be a very poor student of power if I were to conclude that. There is much to be gained from better, more equitable money laundering laws. If you think about it, if our governments stopped chasing crime, if they went after the 2/3 of the pie, if they actually managed to get rich individuals and corporations stop laundering, imagine the money we could have had for the stuff that we genuinely care about. Imagine what we could do with climate change, what we could do with poverty alleviation, healthcare. But the first step of this journey is necessarily recognizing the complicity of the state in the anti-money laundering project. This means rejecting its self-serving narrative. This means saying, we know what you're doing, and we know why you're doing it, and we are not okay with it. Thank you.